On February 10th, 2013, the cruise ship Carnival Triumph was sailing in the Gulf of Mexico with over 3,000 passengers and 1,000 crew members on what was supposed to be a relaxing 4-day Caribbean cruise. Then a fire broke out in the engine room. The fire was extinguished, but it left the ship without power, no engines, no air conditioning, no working toilets. For the next 5 days, the Carnival Triumph drifted powerlessly in the Gulf of Mexico while passengers and crew endured conditions that became so disgusting, the media dubbed it the poop cruise. This is the story of how a dream vacation turned into a floating nightmare of overflowing sewage, food shortages, and unbearable heat, and why 4,000 people were trapped on a ship that became a drifting disaster. Carnival Cruise Lines is one of the largest cruise operators in the world, known for offering affordable, fun ships to millions of passengers every year. The Carnival Triumph was a massive vessel, 893 feet long, 14 decks tall, capable of carrying over 3,000 passengers plus crew. It had pools, restaurants, bars, a theater, a casino, everything you'd expect from a modern cruise ship. On February 7, 2013, the Carnival Triumph departed from Galveston, Texas, on what was advertised as a 4-day cruise to Mexico. It was supposed to be a quick, affordable getaway, perfect for families on a budget, couples looking for a short vacation, and groups of friends wanting to party. The passengers were excited. The weather was good. Everything seemed perfect for a fun cruise. Among the 3,143 passengers were families with children, retirees, young couples, and groups celebrating birthdays or anniversaries. They paid hundreds or thousands of dollars for what they expected to be a relaxing, enjoyable cruise. They packed swimsuits, sunscreen, and cruise-appropriate outfits. They were ready for fun. The crew of 1,086 people were experienced professionals who'd worked on cruise ships before. They knew the routine, knew how to keep passengers happy, and knew how to handle the day-to-day operations of running a floating city. For the first 2 days, everything went according to plan. The ship sailed smoothly through the Gulf of Mexico. Passengers swam in the pools, ate at the buffets, attended shows, and enjoyed their vacation. The Triumph had reached Mexican waters and was heading back toward Galveston. The cruise would be over in just 2 more days. And then, in the early morning hours of February 10th, 2013, everything went horribly wrong. At approximately 5:15 a.m. on Sunday, February 10th, while most passengers were still asleep, a fire broke out in the aft engine room of the Carnival Triumph. The ship was about 150 miles off the coast of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, in international waters in the Gulf of Mexico. The fire started in the ship's engine room, the critical area where the generators and propulsion systems are located. The exact cause was later determined to be a leak in a fuel line that sprayed diesel fuel onto a hot surface, igniting it instantly. The crew responded immediately. The ship's automatic fire suppression system activated, releasing CO2, carbon dioxide, to smother the flames. Crew members fought the fire using emergency protocols. Passengers were woken by announcements to report to their muster stations, the designated emergency assembly points where everyone gathers during a crisis. Passengers, many still in pajamas, grabbed their life jackets and hurried to their muster stations. There was confusion and fear. Was the ship sinking? Were they going to have to abandon ship? Parents held crying children. People tried to call loved ones on their cell phones, but they were too far from shore for reliable signals. The good news: the fire was extinguished relatively quickly. No one was injured. The ship was not sinking. The passengers would not need to abandon ship. The bad news: the fire had destroyed one of the ship's primary generator rooms and severely damaged critical systems. The Carnival Triumph had lost all engine power. It couldn't propel itself, and critically, it had lost most of its electrical generating capacity. What did that mean? It meant no engines to move the ship, no air conditioning. In the Gulf of Mexico in February, where temperatures were in the 80s, limited power for lights, battery backup only in some areas, no elevators, most importantly, no power for the sewage system. That last one would prove to be the defining feature of the next 5 days. Modern cruise ships are essentially floating cities with incredibly complex systems. They generate their own power, produce their own fresh water, and process their own sewage. All of these systems require electricity and functioning machinery. When the Carnival Triumph lost power, the sewage system stopped working properly. The vacuum toilets that normally flush waste into holding tanks couldn't operate without power. Waste began backing up. And with over 4,000 people on board, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Within hours, toilets in passenger cabins stopped flushing or began overflowing. Passengers were told not to use the toilets in their rooms. Instead, they were instructed to use plastic bags, essentially making makeshift toilets, and deposit the bags in large red biohazard bags placed in hallways. Can you imagine? You're on vacation, you paid good money for a nice cruise, and now you're being told to defecate into a plastic bag in your cabin and carry it down the hallway to deposit it in a communal garbage bag. The indignity and disgust were immediate. But it got worse, much worse, as the ship sat powerless in the Gulf of Mexico, drifting with the currents. The sewage situation became a nightmare. The sewage holding tanks overflowed. Raw sewage began leaking out of pipes and drains. It seeped into hallways. It backed up through floor drains. In some areas, sewage was literally flowing down the walls and across floors. Passengers reported stepping in feces while walking through hallways. Some cabins on lower decks became uninhabitable due to sewage backup. The smell was overwhelming. A combination of raw sewage, body odor, no one could shower properly, rotting food, and the general stench of 4,000 people living in increasingly unsanitary conditions. The heat made everything worse. Without air conditioning in the Gulf of Mexico, interior temperatures in the ship climbed into the 90s. Some areas were even hotter. Passengers who stayed in their cabins, trying to avoid the sewage in the halls, sweltered in hot, airless rooms. Many people moved to the open decks, setting up makeshift camps with mattresses and blankets, sleeping outside to escape the heat and smell below. The upper decks became tent cities, with families claiming spots and trying to make the best of an impossible situation. At least on deck, there was fresh air and a breeze. But even on deck, there was no escape from the reality of being trapped on a powerless ship. Food became another major issue. The ship's refrigeration systems weren't working properly without full power. Food was spoiling. Crew tried to provide meals, but the options were limited, and the quality poor. Passengers reported being given cold sandwiches, chips, and not much else. Lines for food were long. Supplies were running low. Drinking water was also a concern. The ship's water desalination systems, which turn seawater into fresh water, require power. With limited power, water production was reduced. Passengers were told to conserve water. Drinking fountains ran dry. People were thirsty, hot, and frustrated. Medical issues began emerging. People were getting sick, some from foodborne illness, likely from food that hadn't been properly refrigerated, others from the unsanitary conditions. There were cases of vomiting and diarrhea, which only added to the sewage nightmare. The ship's medical center was overwhelmed. Fights broke out. Tensions were high. People were hot, hungry, smelly, and fed up. There were reports of passengers arguing over food, over space on the deck, over access to the few working facilities. The crew tried to maintain order, but they were dealing with thousands of increasingly angry people in terrible conditions. Communication with the outside world was limited. Some passengers had satellite phones or were able to get intermittent cell service when the ship drifted closer to shore. Photos and reports began filtering out to news media and social media. Story exploded. Passengers were posting photos and videos on Facebook and Twitter showing sewage in hallways, the tent cities on deck, the long food lines, and the generally deplorable conditions. The media picked up on it immediately. Cable news networks started covering it constantly. And that's when the ship got its infamous nickname, the Poop Cruise. Carnival Cruise Lines was facing a PR nightmare. Images of their ship, which was supposed to represent fun and relaxation, now showed sewage-soaked hallways and miserable passengers. The company's CEO, Jerry Cahill, issued apologies and promised compensation. But for the passengers still trapped on the ship, apologies didn't help. The question everyone was asking, why couldn't they just evacuate the passengers? The answer was complicated. The Carnival Triumph was far from shore, over 150 miles from the nearest land, when the fire occurred. The ship couldn't propel itself, so it was drifting. Evacuating over 4,000 people from a ship in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico isn't simple. Options considered: 1. Helicopter evacuation. Not practical for 4,000 plus people. Helicopters could only evacuate the most urgent medical cases. 2. Transferring to another ship. Possible, but dangerous in open water, especially with elderly passengers and children. 3. Towing to nearest port. This is what was ultimately done. But it takes time. The U.S. Coast Guard and other ships responded to assist. 2 Carnival cruise ships, the Carnival Legend and Carnival Elation, sailed out to provide supplies. They transferred food, water, and electrical generators to the Triumph, but the Triumph still couldn't move under its own power. Tugboats were dispatched to tow the massive ship to port, but towing an 893-foot, 101,000-ton cruise ship through the Gulf of Mexico is not quick. The nearest port with facilities to handle a ship that size was Mobile, Alabama, over 200 miles away once the ship had drifted. The tow began on Tuesday, February 12th, 2 days after the fire. The estimated arrival time, Thursday, February 14th. That meant passengers who thought they'd be home Sunday evening wouldn't get off the ship until Thursday evening. Nearly 5 days trapped on a powerless, sewage-soaked vessel. Those final days of the tow were perhaps the worst. Everyone knew they were heading towards shore, but the ship moved agonizingly slowly, just a few miles per hour, being towed by tugboats. Passengers watched the coastline appear in the distance and creep closer with painful slowness. The sewage situation hadn't improved. If anything, it was worse after 5 days of accumulation. Some passengers reported seeing rats. There were concerns about disease. The heat was relentless. People were exhausted, filthy, and desperate to get off the ship. Finally, on the evening of Thursday, February 14th, Valentine's Day, the Carnival Triumph arrived at the cruise terminal in Mobile, Alabama. But even then, the nightmare wasn't quite over. Disembarkation took hours. Passengers had to wait in lines to finally step off the ship onto solid ground. When they finally did disembark, many passengers kissed the ground. Some cried with relief. Others immediately gave interviews to the massive media presence waiting at the dock, describing the horrors of the poop cruise. Buses were waiting to take passengers back to Galveston, Texas, an 8-hour drive. After everything they'd been through, they still had an overnight bus ride ahead of them before finally getting home. Some passengers flew instead, but either way, it was early Friday morning, February 15th, before most passengers finally made it home a full week after what was supposed to have been a 4-day cruise. The aftermath was a PR disaster for Carnival. The company faced immediate backlash and scrutiny. How had this happened? Why were conditions so bad? Could it have been handled better? Carnival's response included full refund for all passengers. Everyone got their money back for the cruise, $500 cash to each passenger, credit for a future cruise, which many passengers said they would never use. Reimbursement for travel expenses getting home, psychological counseling offered to passengers who wanted it. The total compensation package was valued at approximately $4,400 per passenger on average, but many passengers said no amount of money could make up for what they'd endured. Some filed lawsuits seeking additional damages for emotional distress, negligence, and the deplorable conditions. The investigation into what went wrong found several issues. 1. The fire. The immediate cause was a fuel line leak in the engine room that sprayed diesel onto a hot surface. Maintenance issues may have contributed. The fire suppression system worked, but the fire caused extensive damage to critical systems. 2. Lack of redundancy. Modern cruise ships should have backup systems, but the Triumph's backups were inadequate for a total power loss of this magnitude. When the main generator was destroyed, the backup systems couldn't handle the load of a ship this size. 3. Poor emergency planning. Carnival's emergency protocols didn't adequately address a prolonged power outage scenario. The company seemed unprepared for how quickly conditions would deteriorate without working toilets and air conditioning. 4. Communication failures. Communication with passengers could have been better. Many passengers felt they weren't given accurate information about how long they'd be stuck or how bad conditions would get. 5. Decision-making. Some questioned whether evacuating passengers to other ships earlier would have been better than subjecting them to days of misery. Carnival defended the decision to tow the ship, saying it was the safest option. The U.S. Coast Guard and maritime authorities launched investigations. Carnival was cited for violations and required to implement improvements across its fleet. The incident led to increased scrutiny of cruise ship safety and emergency preparedness across the industry. For Carnival Cruise Lines, the Triumph disaster was devastating for their reputation. In the months following, the company saw a drop in bookings. Their stock price fell. Competitors used the incident in their marketing, promising their ships were better maintained and safer. Carnival spent millions on repairs and upgrades to the Triumph and made fleet-wide improvements to backup power systems sewage system redundancies, and emergency supplies. They also improved crew training for dealing with extended emergencies. The Triumph itself underwent extensive repairs and refurbishment. It was eventually returned to service, renamed Carnival Sunrise in 2019 after a major renovation, though many people said they would never set foot on that ship again. The passengers who endured the poop cruise were forever changed by the experience. For many, it was the vacation from hell that they would never forget, and not in a good way. Some developed anxiety about cruising or traveling. Others could laugh about it eventually, calling it the worst vacation story anyone could tell at a party. The crew members also endured those 5 days, and in many ways, they had it worse. They couldn't just camp out on deck and complain. They had to keep working, trying to keep passengers calm, distribute food and supplies, and manage impossible sanitary conditions while dealing with the same heat, smell, and lack of facilities. The poop cruise became part of popular culture. Late-night comedians made jokes about it for weeks. It was referenced in TV shows and movies. It became shorthand for vacation gone horribly wrong. Even years later, people still remember the Carnival Triumph as that poop cruise ship. The incident raised important questions about cruise ship safety and regulation. Are cruise ships safe? Generally, yes. Millions of people cruise every year without incident. But the Triumph showed that when things go wrong, they can go very wrong very quickly. Are cruise ships regulated adequately? This is debated. Ships registered in foreign countries like the Triumph, which was Bahamas registered, may not be subject to the same strict regulations as US-flagged vessels. After the Triumph, there were calls for stronger international cruise ship regulations. Should passengers be better informed of risks? Many people book cruises without fully understanding what could happen in an emergency. The Triumph incident showed that being trapped on a disabled ship for days is a real possibility. Do cruise lines put profit over safety? Critics argue that cruise lines cut corners on maintenance and safety to maximize profits. The industry disputes this, but acknowledges that there's always room for improvement. The Carnival Triumph poop cruise of 2013 stands as one of the most memorable cruise disasters of the modern era, not because of massive loss of life. Thankfully, no one died. But because of the sheer misery and indignity of what over 4,000 people endured. It's a reminder that even in our modern, technologically advanced world, we're still vulnerable when critical systems fail. A cruise ship without power becomes a floating prison of heat, sewage, and desperation remarkably quickly. For those who were on the Carnival Triumph that week in February 2013, the memory of overflowing toilets, sewage-soaked hallways, unbearable heat, and 5 days trapped on a drifting ship will never fade. They went on a vacation and ended up surviving an ordeal. The Carnival Triumph sailed off that February thinking it was offering people a fun escape. Instead, it gave them nightmares, a lawsuit settlement, and the distinction of being part of what will forever be known as the poop.